Nowadays, China is considered as one of the most progressive nations, with women flourishing in all fields. But ancient China was not like what it looks like today. The concubine and maid cultures are prominent in the history of many nations. However, in Chinese tradition, only the little maids and concubines were not the female lower classes. The wives and daughters of the Chinese were subject to slavery too. These wife slaves lived a life that would shock you. Women's life in ancient China were no less than a rough track. They were considered commodities, especially during the 7th to 10th century. Men were legally allowed to have more than one wife at a time. Pushing the wives into slavery was not supposed to happen, but men sold them into slavery. They sent their wives and daughters to brothels where they were sexually used to become the madam. Men were allowed to have concubines besides wives too. Wives were supposed to raise children and serve the household, whereas concubines were to satisfy men. Young girls that were often sold in the brothels were brought by men and were trained in several areas like reading poetry, conversational skills, and performing services as courtesans. They were then given to brothel women or maid customers' wives through a marriage or money exchange. In a nutshell, women were a matter of good business. During the Song dynasty, the lives of wives were made more pathetic. Their freedom was further diminished. Chastity became common and was preached by male philosophers to women. The married women were confined to houses, and those who were widowed were forbidden to remarry. They ultimately had to stay with their husband's property. Many poor widows who saw financial instability after their husband's death were starving because remarrying was a sin in the tradition and was equal to betrayal. Women were not allowed to leave their houses for days, and discussing the men or their affairs was strictly prohibited. This was all because women in ancient China were considered inferior to men. Marriages in ancient China were arranged. After getting married, the woman moved to their husband's houses. They were completely cut off from their father's houses and were no longer allowed to worship their ancestors. Their loyalty shifted to their husbands and in-laws. They became household servants until they were pregnant and produced a son. After making babies, the status of women was upgraded and they received respect. Having a son was the requirement for females to be accepted in ancient China. That's why men married several women to produce more sons and gain a high social status. Women were not independent. They were considered someone's property, so their killing was immoral. Even a widow would stay committed to her late husband. For crimes, they were sentenced to death, but in a completely private environment. There was a taboo on killing women in China, not because they were sacred, but because they were someone's personal property. No punishment was given to their masters if they were killed or beaten to death. Marriages in ancient China were insane. The bride was made to sit inside the red chair and was carried to the groom's house. Her feet were not allowed to touch the ground to keep the evil spirits away. The insane practice of foot binding was common in Chinese culture, where girls aged 3 had their feet crushed in bindings for years to make them small. It was thought that small feet would appeal to their husbands. What used to happen in practice was that girls' feet in childhood were tightly bound with strips of clothes. Bones at this age are soft, so they fused to shape the foot like a cone. Moreover, the toes grew smaller too. This made them partially disabled for their whole life. They could not have a complete hold over the floor while walking. The never-ending pain and inability to walk properly made their lives nothing less than hell. Foot binding practice increased in the Song dynasty, where every 9 out of 10 women had narrow feet. Laws in ancient China promoted gender discrimination too. A man could divorce a wife, but the wife could not divorce a man if she were mistreated. Divorce was given to women for not bearing a son, being unfaithful, lack of filial piety to the in-laws, stealing, or not making up with her husband. You can get an idea about the peak of humiliation from the fact that women were divorced for suffering from a venereal disease. They were kicked out of the husband's house for being jealous of someone or just due to talking too much. A wife was not allowed to visit the ancestors. Divorce is prohibited if the wife has nowhere to go after that, which means if you have no ancestors, you have to bear a mistreating man until you die or are killed. Class differences made the life of wives worse in China. Upper-class women were more controlled than any other social level. They were restricted to chambers or homes with restricted freedom of women. They had significant responsibilities like management of the household, education of children, and financial management of the house. But all this never made them the head of the home. Farmers' wives were allowed to go out with their husbands to work in fields to cultivate rice. The farmers owned no land and worked as tenants, so they frequently abused their wives. In case of crop failure and droughts, wives of the poor were pushed into prostitution or concubine brothels to earn for their households. Though concubine keeping was legal in ancient China, it was unfair to the wives. Men spent time with their concubines while their wives were left to become a slave of the house. If the official wife fails to bear a male child, she had to bear a co-wife, or in most cases, co-wives. In rare circumstances, men bought the concubines from brothels and married them to make a male child. After that, they were given the status of wife and mistress of the house. Wives worked day and night in homes without having any social life. They were not allowed to have any social status or friends. They were restricted to the people in her house only. In a nutshell, the outer world was completely inaccessible for the wives. People in ancient China were religious and used to worship dragon skulls and their ancestors too. So each household had its ancestors whom they followed and praised. When a girl from the household was married, she had to stop praying to her ancestors completely. Instead, she was forced to pray for the ancestors of her husband's home. Women who had a son were given some importance, and that's why the mother-in-laws of the house was so cruel to their daughters-in-law and forced them to have a baby. Otherwise, they would get divorced by their sons. Not only for wives, but life as a single woman was also hard in the Chinese dynasty. In Chinese tradition, women were forced to live under a conservative rule of 3 obedience and 4 virtues. Sang Kong Shi Di. According to this tradition, women had to stay obedient to their fathers before marriage, their husbands after getting married, and their sons after their husband's death. There was no criteria for men, but for women who had to stay in the frame of obedience despite how she was being treated or living under the rules of the misogynist males. The 4 virtues in the rules were morality, proper speech, modesty and manners, and diligent needlework. Girls were taught all of these in the house of the ancestors and had to apply in their husband's house after being a wife. After being married, wives were not under the control of their husbands. The entire family of her husband ruled her. Merchants who lived away from home for trading were not allowed to take away their wives to the other cities where they went to work. The geographic isolation didn't allow the women to live with their husbands. Due to this, men were allowed to marry in other areas across the world. They had second wives, and polygamy was common in ancient China. You can see the imbalance here. The wife was left to serve her husband's family, where she was treated like a slave. Men came home to produce a child. In most cases, they had their boys from their wives, so the rest were left to serve until she died. They were taught to keep their eyes, head, and voice low. Women were not allowed to study in ancient China. Due to this, most women were illiterate and couldn't speak up for their rights. They were ill-treated by men and were considered inferior. The inferiority complex made them bear the harsh attitudes of the men associated with them. Firstly, their fathers, then their husbands, and at last, their sons ruled on them, due to which they never learned to speak up. The roots of slavery were the formation of the democratic system in ancient China that intended to bind a family together. It tried to give safety to women in the shape of not being divorced and protected in their husband's home. However, this turned to slavery and burdened them with holding up the responsibilities of large families alone and working like she was just born to work. When the concept of literacy came to China, women started recognizing their rights. Many women stood up against the humiliation done by their ancestors, which resulted in their freedom from the chains of slavery. Subscribe to the channel for more historic spice.